The sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of a quaint suburban home. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the kitchen as David, a 35-year-old financial analyst, adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. He glanced at his wife, Emily, who was standing at the counter with a distracted expression, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. David loved this quiet routine. For the past 7 years, he had come to cherish the predictability of their mornings together. Yet lately, something had shifted. David said, tilting his head. Emily snapped out of her thoughts, flashing a quick smile. You've been zoning out a lot these days. Work stress, he asked, trying to sound casual. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Yeah, just the usual. David nodded, but couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Emily had always been a picture of poise and confidence, but recently, there was an air of restlessness about her. As David sat down to his eggs and toast, he glanced over at Emily, scrolling through her phone. She turned the screen away slightly, and David caught the faintest flicker of unease cross her face. You're glued to that thing lately, he teased, though there was an edge to his tone. Just checking emails, Emily said too quickly, setting the phone down screen side down. Later that morning, David stopped by their neighbor Sandra's house to drop off a package. Sandra, a friendly woman in her late 40s, leaned against the doorway with a concerned look. You okay, David? You've been looking a little preoccupied lately. David shrugged. Just work. Why do you ask? Sandra hesitated, then gave him a pointed look. It's probably nothing, but I've noticed. Emily's been having visitors when you're not home. David froze, the words hanging in the air like a thundercloud. Visitors? Sandra nodded. A guy, mid-30s, well-dressed. I assumed he was a work colleague, but he's been here a lot lately. David forced a laugh. Probably one of her clients. Sandra's silence lingered too long. That evening, David watched Emily closely. She seemed cheerful, even affectionate, but there was a slight edge to her movements, a quick glance at the clock, a moment of hesitation before answering questions. As they climbed into bed, David leaned over to kiss her. She turned her head at the last second, his lips brushing her cheek. Good night, she murmured, rolling away. David stared at the ceiling for hours, the neighbor's words echoing in his mind. The next morning, David decided to work from home, something he rarely did. He kissed Emily goodbye as she left for the gym, her tone overly casual. As the door clicked shut, David opened her laptop. It was locked. He moved to her desk drawer and found an unfamiliar envelope addressed to her, with a return address he didn't recognize. Inside was a receipt for an expensive dinner, one he hadn't shared with her. His heart pounded as the first threads of doubt began to weave into certainty. Emily returned home later than usual that evening, her hair damp from a shower, her face flushed. The treadmill was brutal today, she said, tossing her gym bag aside. David smiled thinly, deciding to wait. He needed more than suspicion before he could confront her. The stage was set. Over the next few days, David's unease grew into a gnawing anxiety. It was as if his entire world, his love for Emily, their life together, was slipping through his fingers, crumbling under the weight of his doubts. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when things had started to go wrong, but every small detail added to the mounting pressure in his chest. It was a Thursday afternoon when David noticed the first glaring change. Emily had always been punctual. Whether it was a dinner date, a casual meet-up with friends, or just their usual quiet evenings, she was always home on time. But on this particular evening, Emily was late, an hour late. David had just gotten home from the office and was sitting on the couch, trying to distract himself with his laptop. His phone buzzed. A message from Emily. Sorry, running late, will be home soon. No explanation. No reason. He waited, tapping his foot anxiously against the floor. His thoughts kept circling back to the strange encounter with Sandra earlier in the week. The clock ticked on, and Emily didn't arrive until 8:45. When she finally stepped through the door, Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She was wearing a loose, unfamiliar jacket, something he didn't recall her owning. "Long day?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Emily gave a tight-lipped nod. "Yeah, just had to finish some paperwork for work. You know how it is." David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He hadn't seen any paperwork when he glanced through her bag earlier that day. That weekend, David took a more active role in his investigation. Emily had insisted on going to a yoga class in the morning, something she rarely did on weekends. She had always enjoyed spending her Saturdays with David, whether it was running errands or relaxing at home. But today, she was leaving, and with a suspiciously hurried tone, she mentioned meeting a friend afterward. David didn't press her. He simply told her he'd take care of things at home. When Emily left, David immediately started searching her belongings. He was careful, too careful, afraid she might return early. The smell of her perfume still lingered on her pillow as David rifled through the drawer beside their bed. He had never done this before, and the guilt clawed at his chest with every item he touched. As he sifted through some papers, a small slip of paper caught his eye. It was a receipt from a fancy restaurant, dated the night before. The name on the bill was a man's, someone he didn't recognize. The receipt was tucked inside a folder with her personal notes, almost as if she'd hidden it deliberately. David's hands trembled as he read the amount, $2.50. She had never spent that much on dinner alone. And if it wasn't a business dinner, who had she been with? The next week, as Emily was in the shower, David decided to take another look at her phone. He had resisted before, respecting her privacy, but now the nagging suspicion had consumed him. He scrolled through her recent messages. The first thing that caught his eye was the unusual name that appeared often, Chris. There were multiple messages between them throughout the day, each one more casual than the last. Nothing outright suspicious, but the frequency of the exchanges set off alarms in David's mind. He knew he had to dig deeper. The final message, however, made David's heart drop into his stomach. It was from Chris. It simply read, "Can't wait for tonight, love." David's hands began to sweat, and his mind raced. Was he reading too much into this? Was there a reasonable explanation? No, he knew there wasn't. The days following that discovery were filled with tension. David could hardly look at Emily without feeling a wave of resentment and betrayal wash over him. He started noticing her behavior more intently. The way she would slip her phone into her bag, her sudden quietness when she thought he wasn't listening. The real turning point came during a seemingly mundane phone call. David had been on a work call when he overheard Emily talking to someone in the other room. The door was ajar, and he froze when he heard the unmistakable voice on the other end of the line. "Are you sure he's not coming home early?" It was Chris. David's pulse quickened. His stomach churned. He couldn't move. "I told you I'll be home late. Just relax," Emily's voice replied. "I'll leave when I know he's gone for sure." David's throat tightened. He had to get out of there. His mind was racing, overwhelmed with the realization that he had been living in a lie for who knows how long. He had to confront her. That evening, after a long day of internal struggle, David decided it was time to face Emily. The evidence was irrefutable. There was no more pretending, no more avoiding the truth. As Emily arrived home, David stood in the living room, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her as she walked through the door. She stopped in her tracks when she saw his expression. "David," she asked, her voice strained. "Emily," he said coldly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I know what's been going on." Her face paled. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," he snapped, stepping closer. "I know about Chris. I know about the dinners. I know about the messages." Emily recoiled, her face flushed with panic. "David, please. It's not what you think." David took a deep breath, his heart hammering in his chest. "Then tell me what it is, Emily. What is it? Because everything I've seen says something different." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned away, unable to meet his gaze. The evening was unusually quiet. The house felt empty despite Emily's presence, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. David sat at the kitchen table, staring down at the receipt from the restaurant, his fingers clenched around it like a lifeline. His heart pounded in his chest, the anger, betrayal, and confusion swirling together into a toxic storm. He had given Emily every opportunity to come clean, but she hadn't. And now he knew what he had to do. David didn't wait for Emily to return home. He grabbed his coat and slipped out of the house, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The decision had been made. He couldn't let this go on any longer. As he pulled into the parking lot of the upscale hotel where Emily had dined with Chris, according to the receipt, his hands shook on the steering wheel. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, but had also known was inevitable. David walked into the hotel's lobby, his footsteps echoing in the polished floors. He didn't even know why he was surprised. Deep down, he had known that Emily's secret life wasn't some innocent affair. It was a betrayal, a cruel and calculated betrayal. He approached the front desk and gave the receptionist Emily's name. "She's in room 312, the receptionist said without hesitation. David's breath caught. The world around him seemed to blur as his legs carried him toward the elevator. The doors opened with a soft ding, and he stepped inside, his mind fixated on what he would find. Was Chris with her right now? Would she try to explain away her actions? Or was this the moment she would finally admit the truth? The elevator door opened with a soft whoosh. David's heart skipped a beat. Room 312 was just a few feet away. He hesitated for a split second before walking briskly down the hallway. As he approached the door, he could hear voices, low, intimate whispers. His pulse quickened. The air felt heavy, thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. He raised his hand to knock, but the words stuck in his throat. Before he could make a sound, the door clicked open, and there stood Emily. Her eyes widened in shock as she looked at David. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively reached to pull the door shut behind her. But David was faster. He pushed the door open with force, stepping inside the room before she could stop him. Behind Emily stood Chris, the man David had only seen in fleeting text messages, but now he was flesh and blood, standing in front of him like a ghost from his worst nightmare. "David, what are you doing here?" Emily's voice trembled, panic flaring in her eyes. David's gaze flicked between her and Chris, his eyes burning with rage. "You don't get to ask me that," he spat, his voice low, but filled with fury. "You've been lying to me for weeks. No, for months. I've been watching you, Emily. Every text, every dinner, every phone call." Emily recoiled as if struck, her eyes filled with guilt and fear. But Chris stepped forward, an air of arrogance about him. "Hey, man, it's not what you think." His voice was smooth calm, as if he were trying to defuse a situation that didn't need defusing. David's anger flared. "Not what I think. How could it be anything else?" He turned his back to Chris, fixing his gaze on Emily. "You've been sleeping with him, haven't you?" There was a long, painful pause. Emily's silence was enough of an answer. "David," Emily said, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I never wanted to hurt you." David's chest tightened. "Then why did you do it? Why him? Why this?" "I don't know. It just happened. I was lonely, and things between us, things weren't the way they used to be. I thought I could keep it from you." Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands trembling. David's heart shattered. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He had known deep down that something was wrong, but hearing her confess it in front of him made the weight of the betrayal unbearable. "I trusted you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with pain. Emily looked down, her shoulders slumped. "I'm so sorry, David. I never wanted you to find out like this." But just as David was about to speak again, Chris interrupted, stepping forward with a smug expression on his face. "David, look, you don't get it. This was never about you, okay?" "Emily," and we have something real. You should just move on." David's anger flared even brighter. "Real? You think what you're doing is real? You think lying and sneaking around is love?" Chris smirked, unfazed by David's rage. "What does it matter? It's over between you two. Just let it go." David's fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with fury. He wanted to say something to hit him, but the words felt like lead in his mouth. He turned to Emily, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. "Is this how it ends, Emily? With you and him? With lies and more lies?" Emily flinched, as though the words physically hurt her. She opened her mouth, but before she could say anything, David took a deep breath and walked toward the door. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "But I can't be here. I can't be with you." Before Emily could reach out, he slammed the door behind him, leaving her standing there with Chris, her life unraveling in front of her. David's hand was on the doorknob of the elevator when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hand still shaking. A message from Sandra. "David, you need to know something. Emily wasn't the first one to start this affair. Chris, he's been seeing someone else too. A married woman. Her husband is in the same office as you. Please be careful." David's blood ran cold. He glanced back at the hotel room door, feeling the weight of the new revelation settling over him. The world felt heavier in the days after David stormed out of the hotel room. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal, the lies, or the suffocating sense of loss that followed. His mind replayed that confrontation over and over, the image of Emily standing there with Chris, her face crumpled in guilt, while Chris tried to justify everything with a casual smirk. David had always prided himself on his ability to trust, to give his all in relationships. Now, it felt as though that trust had been shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The first few days after the confrontation were the hardest. David found himself wandering through their empty house, unable to focus on anything. He couldn't go back to work, couldn't sit still. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of the life he thought he had with Emily, the pictures on the wall, the shared memories they had once held so dear. Emily had tried calling him multiple times, leaving messages. "David, please. We need to talk. I didn't mean for it to happen this way." But David didn't answer. He couldn't find the words to speak to her. How could he? After everything she had done, how could they possibly talk? David's friends reached out, offering support. But they didn't understand. They hadn't seen the woman he had built his life around betray him in such a brutal, public way. What could they say? They could only offer sympathy, empty words that didn't ease the ache in his chest. Emily, on the other hand, was a mess. She hadn't expected David to react this way. Not that there had been a way to predict how things would unfold. She hadn't expected him to walk away without trying to understand, without allowing room for her to explain. But the shame she felt in the aftermath was almost unbearable. The guilt gnawed at her every waking hour, twisting her stomach. She tried calling David repeatedly, but every time, her calls went unanswered. She texted him, "I know I've made a mistake, but please, David, I love you. Can we talk?" But no response. Emily sought solace in her friends, though they had mixed reactions. Sandra, the woman she confided in most, was sympathetic but blunt. "What did you expect, Emily? You can't just tear apart everything David built and expect him to forgive you with a simple apology. It's going to take time if it ever happens at all." The truth was harsh, but Emily couldn't deny it. David wasn't just angry, he was devastated. She had destroyed something sacred. There was no easy way back. In the midst of this chaos, Chris contacted Emily, a text arriving late one evening. "Are you okay?" Her heart dropped when she saw his name. He was the one who had helped drag her into this mess, the one who had crossed all boundaries in his pursuit of her. And now, after everything that had happened, he was reaching out. "Chris," she replied, her fingers shaking, "we need to talk. But not like this. I need space." Chris didn't take the hint. He showed up at her door that evening, unannounced, demanding to see her. Emily opened the door hesitantly, half expecting him to apologize, to try and fix things with words. Instead, he looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes made her stomach turn. "You know it's over, right? I can't keep doing this. You need to choose David or me." Emily recoiled, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she anticipated. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. Chris, this is too much right now," she stammered, trying to keep herself composed. "I need time to think. Please just go." But Chris wasn't satisfied. He stepped forward, his eyes hardening. "I've already given you time. Don't expect me to wait forever. I'm not David, Emily. You can't string me along like this. It's over." He turned on his heel and left, leaving her standing there, feeling more alone than she ever had before. David was no stranger to heartbreak. But this was different. It wasn't just the betrayal of a partner. It was the complete destruction of everything he had believed in, his love, his trust, his vision of the future. He couldn't even bring himself to look at the ring on his finger anymore. It felt like an anchor, weighing him down, reminding him of everything that was lost. One night, as he sat in the dark, staring at the half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his heart leaping in his chest for a moment. It was from Emily. "David, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I need you to understand that I never meant for things to get so out of control. I was lonely, and I made terrible choices. But I love you. Please, let's talk. Just once. For us." David stared at the message, his heart torn in two. On the one hand, he still loved her. She was the woman he had shared everything with, the woman he had built his life around. But on the other hand, how could he trust her again? How could he even begin to heal when the wound was so deep, so raw? When David finally spoke to his parents, he could barely contain the emotion that bubbled up. His mother listened quietly, her hand on his shoulder, while his father, always more stoic, offered few words. "I don't know how you're going to get past this," his father finally said, his voice heavy with concern. "But you need to think carefully. What you decide next could change everything for both of you." David couldn't find the strength to answer. How could he decide anything with so many emotions pulling him in different directions? The days passed in a blur. He went through the motions of work, of daily life, but none of it mattered. Nothing felt the same. He had to face a painful reality. No matter what Emily said, no matter what Chris's departure signified, some things couldn't be repaired. Back at home, Emily was in a similar place. Her heart ached for David, for what they had lost. But the truth was, she had to come to terms with the fact that she had made her own bed. Even if David forgave her, could their relationship ever go back to what it had been? Could they ever rebuild after the devastation she had caused? She spent countless nights crying in her empty bed, feeling the weight of her decisions suffocating her. As the days turned into weeks, David found himself standing at a crossroads. He didn't know what the future held, and he certainly didn't know if forgiveness was even possible. What he did know was that both he and Emily had been irrevocably changed. The question now was whether they could move forward from the wreckage, or if the damage was too deep to overcome. The cold breeze of early autumn swept through the cracks in the windowsill, signaling the turning of a new season. The world outside was changing, the leaves turning from vibrant green to the muted golds and reds of fall. But inside David's house, time seemed to have stopped. It had been 2 months since that night at the hotel. 2 months since everything had fallen apart. Since that raw, explosive confrontation that had exposed the darkest corner of their marriage. He could still hear Emily's pleading voice in his ears, but now it felt like a distant memory. David had spent these weeks in a haze. He'd avoided Emily's calls and messages, refusing to let himself be swayed by the remorse that seemed to seep into every word she wrote. Yet there were moments, quiet, painful moments, when his heart ached for her. And in those moments, he'd remember the woman he had married, the woman who had once held his hand, made him laugh, and shared his dreams. Could that person still be inside her? Or had she disappeared forever, replaced by someone unrecognizable? Emily had been to therapy. It hadn't been easy. The first few sessions had felt like her world was crashing down all over again. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the broken promises, and the guilt that weighed on her chest every day. She hadn't expected things to spiral so quickly, to lose control of herself, but she had. The most painful part, though, was the realization that David hadn't been the only one she'd betrayed. She had betrayed herself. She had allowed her own insecurities, her fears of never being enough, to lead her into someone else's arms. She had never truly taken the time to understand her own needs and desires, never questioned why she had felt empty in her marriage to begin with. Now the answers seemed clearer than ever, but it was too late for easy solutions. Emily had been staying at her sister's place for the last few weeks, trying to get some space, to breathe. She still held out a fragile hope that David might come around, that he would forgive her in time. But even she knew that hope was quickly fading. Her final message to him came one evening, just as the sun was setting. "David, I'm sorry. I will always be sorry for what I did to you. I know forgiveness is not something you owe me, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for this. I'll always love you, but I think it's time we both moved on. I can't keep waiting for a love that may never return. Please, take care of yourself." David stood by his window as the leaves fluttered outside, feeling the weight of Emily's message in his hands. His heart, torn into pieces, seemed to throb painfully in his chest. How had it come to this? How had their marriage, once filled with hope and laughter, collapsed under the weight of betrayal? For a long time, he couldn't bring himself to open the message. The words on the screen blurred as his eyes filled with tears. This was the final step, he knew, the final goodbye. But could he let go? Could he truly walk away from the life they had shared? He had tried. He had tried to bury the pain, to focus on work, to distract himself with everything that could keep him from feeling the weight of what had been lost. But no matter how far he ran, the emptiness remained. He missed her, the way she laughed, the way her touch had once been a comfort. And he couldn't deny that a small part of him still loved her. But was love enough to rebuild what had been shattered? David spent several days reflecting on the situation, replaying the moments they'd shared, weighing the memories against the hurt. Slowly, he came to a decision. He couldn't forget. Not yet, maybe never. But he could forgive. Not for her, but for himself. The rage, the bitterness, had already taken too much from him. It was time to let go of that weight. The following morning, David did something he hadn't done in months. He sat down and wrote Emily a letter. It wasn't an apology or a plea for reconciliation. It was simply a reflection on everything they had shared, everything that had been broken, and everything that had led them to this point. "Dear Emily, I've spent the last few months thinking about us, about everything we had, everything we lost, and everything I'm still trying to make sense of. There is no simple way to fix what happened, no quick way to rebuild what was shattered. But I realized something. You're not the only one who needs healing. I need it too. I've spent too long focusing on the pain, on what you did. It's time to focus on moving forward. I forgive you. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget, but I am choosing to let go of the anger. You've hurt me in ways I can't put into words, but I'm not going to let that define me. I can't. We both need to move on, and we both need to find our own paths to healing. I will always care for you, Emily, but it's time for us to go our separate ways. Take care, David." David sat back after writing it, taking a deep breath. It felt strange to say goodbye in such a formal, detached way, but it was necessary. There was no going back, not in any meaningful way. They had reached a fork in the road, and it was time to walk in different directions. When Emily received David's letter, she sat still for a long time, absorbing the words he had written. She had hoped for a moment that there would be a plea for reconciliation, a desire to try again. But there was nothing like that in his message. Instead, it was a final act of kindness, a gift of peace that she had never expected. Emily sat with the letter, tears slipping down her cheeks as she reflected on everything they had been through. There was a deep sadness within her, but also a sense of liberation. She had made her choice long ago, and now it was time to accept the consequences. The healing process would take years, maybe longer. But as she folded the letter and placed it carefully in the drawer, she understood. The love they once shared would always remain. But sometimes, love wasn't enough to save a marriage. Months later, David stood outside the cafe where he and Emily had first met. The same feeling of nervous excitement he had felt back then stirred in his chest. He had come a long way since the pain of the affair, and while the scars still lingered, they had healed enough to allow him to move on. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was no longer bound by the past. As he walked inside, he saw her. Emily sat at a table, looking up as he approached. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't about unfinished business or what could have been. It was about acceptance. They exchanged a quiet smile. "David," she said softly, "it's good to see you." "It's good to see you too," he replied, sitting down. And for the first time in months, David felt peace. Not because things were fixed, but because he had finally let go. The future, whatever it held, was now theirs to choose.